These are 9 different apochromatic refractors, all mounted on the Sky-watcher Star Adventurer GTi, which is a popular go-to mount due to its small size and relatively low cost. The biggest issue with the GTi, it has a fairly restrictive payload limit of just 11 pounds or 5 kilograms. So if you want to use a telescope on it for astrophotography, it has to be a fairly small, lightweight telescope. So in this video, I'm testing out 9 different telescopes that on paper should work on the GTi for photographing deep space. The contenders are the Takahashi FS-60CB, the Founder Optics Draco 62, the Starfield Gear60 Quad, the William Optics Redcat 51, the Askar SQA55, the Askar 71F, the Svbony SV555, the Apertura 60 EDR, and the Askar FMA180 Pro. Hi, my name is Nico. I'm an astrophotographer supported by this YouTube channel and my generous Patreon community, which starts at just $1 per month. Since this is a review, I do have to go through some disclosures here at the beginning. I know these are boring, and there are a lot of them for this one, but they are required by both the FCC in the United States and my own review policy that's published on my website. Starting from the ground up, I used 2 GTIs for this review. One I bought myself and one is on long-term loan from Sky-watcher USA. I used a ZWO ASI 2600 Air and a 2600 Duo for the testing cameras, and these are both on long-term loan from ZWO. The following telescopes are on loan solely for this review by their respective manufacturers. The Svbony SV555, the Askar SQA55, the Starfield Optics Gear60, the Founder Optics Draco 62, and the Apertura 60 EDR. The Askar 71F was sent for a previous review, and I held on to it for this review. I offered to return the William Optics Redcat 51 a couple of years ago after its initial review, but William Optics opted for me to keep it long term. So I don't actually have 9 copies of the GTi mount. This is a special effects shot, but I do have 2 copies, and I tested every telescope on both copies of the GTi that I have to make sure that my findings carry over between at least 2 copies of the mount, which I'm glad to say they did. And this one has been on loan for 3 years from Sky-watcher, so it's well used. I've used it probably over 50 times. This one is brand new. I bought it just for this review, and so it's only been used on the 6 or 7 nights that it took to make this review. Yes, this review is a little different than my previous reviews where I've tried to do everything on one night, just sort of equalize conditions, but that wasn't possible this time around for various reasons, but mostly because it's 9 telescopes. There's just not enough time on any one object. But I did try to equalize conditions as much as I could. All the images that I actually used that I'm showing in the review, I took from right here, my backyard in New Hampshire, which is a Bortle 3 sky. I took them with no moonlight. The object that I was shooting, Vandenberg 31, was always captured at least 50 degrees above the horizon. While this video is mostly about reviewing these 9 different refractor telescopes, you'll notice that when I get to each telescope, I'll also talk about how it performed on the GTi, whether or not I recommend it on the GTi, and then I'll have a little section towards the end specifically on the GTi mount, because even though I've reviewed it twice before on this channel, they've made some little small improvements if you buy the mount now, and then also all my testing that I've done with the telescopes and the ASI Air, which was new to me with the GTi, has given me some new insights to share. All right, let's jump in now to reviewing each telescope, starting with the Takahashi. As Kevin Legore from Sky-watcher said on a recent call with me, this is the OG. This is the original small premium refractor. The first version of the Takahashi FS-60 came out in 1999 in Japan, about 20 years before the Redcat 51 in 2019, or any of the other small telescopes that I'm testing here, which have come out since 2019. So I've always wanted to try out this Takahashi. or any Takahashi. This is my first one, but they're all pricey, including this one, even though it's small. The current total price for the FS-60CB, as I've configured it here, is about $1,950 US. So just shy of $2,000. And that's $1,040 for the telescope tube, $710 for the reducer, and about $200 for the rings, dovetail, adapters, and spacers. So this is the most expensive option that I'm testing out of the 9 telescopes, and part of the reason the Takahashi FS-60 is expensive is because it uses an exotic fluorite lens design. Fluorite is a crystal. It's the crystallized form of calcium fluoride, and very few telescope makers work with fluorite because it's a more expensive but perhaps superior way to make a telescope apochromatic. This is a doublet telescope, meaning it's inside the telescope tube is just 2 glass elements up here at the front. But of course, the reducer that I bought is also a corrector. So it flattens the field and hopefully makes the stars sharper on a larger camera sensor. This is a pretty extreme reducer at 0.72x. They're often 0.8 or 0.85. So that brings the specs down from a native 355 millimeter focal length at f5.9 to 255 focal length at f4.2. For a refractor, f4.2 is pretty fast. This whole thing though is still pretty lightweight, configured like I have it here. It's just a tad over 2 kilograms or 4.5 pounds, which gives you plenty left on the GTi for cameras and accessories. As with anything Takahashi, none of the connections are standard, at least standard by today's US market, and maybe they're standard in Japan. For example, the reducer ends in 52 millimeter threads, which basically forces you to either get something custom made or buy a Takahashi adapter. Eventually, I worked it out as cheaply as possible for me. So I'm going from the Takahashi reducer at 52 millimeter threads to Canon EF adapter. And then I have a Canon EF to M54 adapter. So now I'm at M54 threads, and from there I can just use M54 spacers to get the correct back spacing for the reducer, which is 56.2 millimeters. In terms of mechanics, I like how big both the focusing lock knob and the reducer lock knob are. Even when I'm wearing these thicker winter gloves, they're no problem to turn them. And that's not true of all telescopes. A lot of times they make the knobs too small and they're hard to turn with thick gloves. And when it's well below 0 out at night, I don't want to take my gloves off to do these kinds of things. So that's a big plus for me on the mechanics side. Neither the focuser draw tube nor the manual rotator have any markings, which has become more standard in recent years and can be helpful. Out of the box, it's just a single speed focuser. So if you're used to fine tuning focus with a reduction knob, you're out of luck here. The fine focuser attachment from Takahashi is an additional $350, so I didn't get it. But despite single speed focuser, I didn't have any problems reaching focus quickly and finding focus with the FS-60 using a Bodnov mask. And overall, the Takahashi FS-60 does work well with the GTi. It's not too long. I think it looks very well proportioned on the mount, and it's well below any weight limit, even with all the imaging accessories and cameras attached. With the standard Sky-watcher tripod with fairly normal 5 to 10 mile an hour winds, I was still getting around stars most of the time. With 20 mile an hour winds and even stronger wind gusts, it was definitely a losing battle without some kind of wind block, but that was actually true of every scope I tested, even the smallest ones. So I'm gonna give the FS-60CB with the reducer my full stamp of approval to be well suited for astrophotography use on the GTi. Okay, next up is the Founder Optics, and Founder Optics has their FOT line of 3 refractors now. And I've reviewed the other 2, the 86 and the 106 on this channel, so the Draco 62 here is the final one for me to check out. And it's currently selling for $1,099 in the US Founder Optics always includes a lot of accessories with their telescopes, everything you could possibly need. With their 86 and 106, the field flattener is included. With this scope, since it's a quintuplet, the flattener is already inside the scope, and instead they include a 0.83x reducer. And so that means this scope can be used photographically at 300 millimeter f4.8 or 250 millimeter at f3.9 right out of the box. It can also be used visually. They included a mirror diagonal for using the scope with an eyepiece, and this all comes packaged with a normal travel case inside this awesome travel backpack, offering sort of like 2 levels of protection because it's like a padded case inside a padded case. And probably this is the best packaging I've ever seen with a telescope. Really cool. What I like about this is it's roomy enough that there's plenty of room for a camera, a guide scope, cables, dew heater bands, a bunch of essential imaging accessories in addition to everything they included with the telescope. I use this telescope only with the reducer. So I was at 250 millimeters at f3.9. That's just sort of what I did with all of the telescopes. If they had a reducer, I used it. And that makes it the f3.9 makes it the fastest of the 9 tested. So it's the Takahashi is at f4.2. This one's at f3.9. Everything else was slower than that. In this configuration, it weighs the same as the Gear60, which I'll review in a moment, just a hair under 3 kilograms or 6.5 pounds. So again, a little heavy for the GTi, workable with the right conditions. Maybe you'd want to get a heavier tripod, but yeah, it's doable. It's at least worth testing. The color scheme is black. It's sort of a mattish black with these green accents. I definitely think it looks well matched on the GTi here. The dew shield has this pretty interesting locking system. Instead of a knob, it has this full ring that you turn to loosen that up, and then you can push it back out and twist this whole ring to lock it. I thought that was pretty neat. It feels very premium, I guess. And anything Founder Optics, I would say, like feels premium kind of in terms of mechanics. The focuser is a 2-inch rack and pinion. It does have a little cool indicator window with the distance you're out. The manual rotator does have very clearly marked degree markings, which is nice for getting repeatable rotation angle. It does have a standard kind of tilt attachment. I guess they maybe had a different kind of tilt mechanism before and then they've changed it. I didn't use the tilt mechanism, but it's very nice that it's included because at f3.9, you're probably going to see some tilt. While the focal length is good for the GTi, it is, as I mentioned, a little bit heavy for the mount in my experience with the GTi. So if you're a beginner, I think it'd be better to pair this with a slightly beefier mount with a bigger tripod or a harmonic mount. If you want to make it work on the GTi, I'd really suggest a heavier tripod than what comes with the GTi, or if you had it like in an observatory, that'd be fine too. Moving on, Starfield Optics is a Canadian company that makes various telescopes and astronomy accessories. This is their Starfield Gear60 Quad, which, as the name suggests, is a quadruplet apo, and it's currently selling for $1,050 US. There is one FPL53 glass element, which is a well-regarded glass for refractors produced by Ohara in Japan. The Gear60 has a focal length of 300 millimeters at f5. It comes with all the hardware you need for imaging, including a Vixen dovetail, a top handle with holes for attaching things, a guide shoe, and a dual speed focuser. But everything's sort of all set in the package. With front and back caps off, it weighs nearly 3 kilograms or 6.5 pounds, so the same as the Draco 62 with the reducer. And this, again, puts it a little bit on the heavy side for the GTi. You know, you have to be careful about what else you add so that you're not like getting into the, like over the 75% of the payload limit where the GTi doesn't perform quite as well. Backspacing should be no problem with this scope. Personally, I used 55 millimeters from the 48 millimeter threads on the back of the focuser here. This piece right here is removable, and you can put a 2-inch filter in here if you want to put the filter inside the telescope like that, or you can remove this piece entirely, which gives you 54 millimeter female threads instead of 48 millimeter male threads. Both 54 and 48 are pretty standard in terms of spacers and adapters, so that's great. On full frame sensors, you may want to go with an all 54 millimeter diameter image train to avoid vignetting. That's the reason I mention it. The focuser seems very solid. It's a 2.5 rack and pinion with a 10-to-1 reduction knob on the right, pretty standard for a modern imaging refractor. It does have markings on the draw tube for distance with the focus, and it also has tilt adjustment like the Founder Optics. I didn't use the tilt mechanism, but it's definitely appreciated. It also has a manual rotator, no angle markings on the rotator. And the dew shield is retractable, but curiously doesn't have a lock. Now I did try it with a fairly heavy flat panel with the telescope pointed up, and it didn't collapse under the weight of that flat panel, but my worry is over time with repeated use like that, it might not hold up over time. The Gear60 does come with a very nice soft-sided travel case with custom cutouts, not only for the telescope fully assembled, but optional cutouts that you can just remove these foam inserts for a motor focuser and an astronomy camera. So that's really great thinking on their part because a lot of times the travel case that comes with these refractors doesn't have things like that. But they've kept the case pretty small while still giving you some good options there. In terms of compatibility with the GTi, it's a little on the heavy side as mentioned. So if you want to use this on the GTi, I'd consider looking at some kind of wind block, a heavy duty tripod, something like that, because with just the default tripod and no wind protection, I noticed that even with 10 to 15 mile an hour wind gusts, you could get noticeable elongation in the sub exposures. So you just end up throwing away a lot more of your data. There's ways around that for sure, but to be safe, I'd probably recommend going up to a slightly heavier duty mount with this telescope. You know, something like the AM3, the Wave 100, the Sky-watcher AL55i, I should be able to try pretty soon and give you a report on that. So something to consider. Still possible with the GTi, but for a beginner, probably wouldn't recommend a scope this heavy. Next, we have the William Optics Redcat 51. This is the telescope that sort of launched the modern explosion of small premium refractors with focal lengths under 300 millimeters. And I remember in 2019 when the Redcat came out, I thought it was a really cool idea because I was used to rigging up camera lenses to get my wide field deep sky fix. So to have something actually designed out of the box for Astro at 250 millimeter focal length and come in at below $1,000 was new at the time because like as I said, the Takahashi was available but more expensive. So this came in initially, I think on the Kickstarter, it was like $600, and then it went up a little bit over the years, over the past 5 years, you know, due to inflation, like most Astro stuff. So now it's up to $850, but they also have made a number of improvements. They're on the third version, which now uses a different focusing system. I have the second version of the Redcat here, which still had the more camera lens-like focusing ring, but the optics are the same in version 2 and 3 of the Redcat. I think actually the optics have been the same all along, version 1, 2, and 3. And it's 250 millimeter focal length at f4.9. It's a quadruplet design. I think they say it's a Petsfall, meaning 2 and 2, and it uses FPL53 glass for the apo element. And as you can see here, it's mostly red and black, which is sort of their trademark, with the cat branding as well. And they incorporated a Bodnov mask into the telescope's front cap, which was also a new kind of development. And I've replaced my Bodnov mask in the cap with a 3D printed insert from Luke, from Luke Amatico's YouTube channel. And Luke's 3D print is a little bit more precise than the one that came with it, but both can work. The dew shield is reversible, so you can put it in the reversed position for storage. There is a tilt adjustment option here on the back, and you can use M54 or M48 threads to connect to the telescope. The Redcat comes with a custom soft-sided case that is well designed, but it doesn't have room for a camera. The weight of the telescope without front and back caps is 1.8 kilograms or 4 pounds, which is a good match for the GTi. And I didn't run into any problems personally with using the Redcat 51 on the GTi. It performed well, and so I can say this is a good combination due to its lightweight and fairly short focal length. It's sort of what I would recommend a lot of people for the GTi up till now. Sort of the standard bearer, I think, for a small telescope on a small mount. So part of the reason I was interested in this comparison is to see, you know, with all these other options out, how the Redcat 51 compares. This is a fairly new one from Askar. It's called their SQA55. And they're selling it for $795 in the US market. It's not their first venture into the more lens-like telescopes. I've previously reviewed the Askar ACL 200, which, as the name suggests, has 200 millimeter focal length. But this one is their first to use both an ED glass element, as they normally would, and an SD glass element. So let me explain what that means. ED stands for extra low dispersion, and SD is super low dispersion. So examples of super low dispersion are natural fluorite, like what's in the Takahashi, and what is sometimes called synthetic fluorite glass, with names like FPL53, already mentioned, FPL55, those are both from Ohara, and then we have FCD100 from Hoya. So they're premium glass elements that should give us better correction, theoretically at least. And better correction means tighter stars, less chromatic aberration, all that good stuff. It is a quintuplet, meaning 5 glass elements inside. I think a triplet plus 2 more glass elements spaced back for the correction. It has a focal length of 264 millimeters, focal ratio of f4.8. It comes fully assembled in a nice hard case with a custom foam insert. This is like a Pelican style case. There isn't much room in the case for extras, but this piece is removable, gives you a little bit more space, but not enough space for a camera, for example. The weight of the telescope without caps is 2.1 kilograms or 4 pounds, 11 ounces. This is still in the sweet spot of weight for the GTi, I would say. The dew shield is not retractable, but it is removable and reversible. And so that's nice to save on space. The front of the telescope lens has a filter thread, which is unusual for telescopes, but this has a standard 67 millimeter filter thread. There are 3 different rings on the barrel. The first one is for changing the aperture. So yes, this does have an internal iris like a camera lens. You can stop it down all the way to f22, which can be useful again for daytime use. I kept it for astrophotography wide open at f4.8. The back ring is the coarse focus, and then the middle ring is a fine focus ring, which is nice to have, but I didn't really find it necessary, as I could usually find focus quickly with the coarse focus ring using a Badenov mask. Askar has a new system for attachment here with the SQA55. This is a big chonky tube ring, and then the telescope tube can actually rotate within this ring. There's a knob for locking that rotation down. And then around this tube ring, there are 4 quick release attachment points, and then you can attach Askar quick release handles and mounts to any of these. In principle, I do like this, but there were 2 things about it, the way that it was implemented, that I wasn't so sure about. The first one is a small thing, but the Vixen dovetail is by default attached to the mounting shoe here with just 1 screw, And it's my least favorite screw type for Astro because having this little handle here suggests to me that I should feel comfortable just using my fingers to tighten this one screw to hold the whole telescope, the whole payload onto the dovetail, which is not a good idea. So I see why they did it, because it's like, it makes it more like photographic use to have that little type of screw. But for Astro, I wouldn't recommend ever just like hand tightening a screw to hold a dovetail on. So the first thing I would do is replace this screw with two just standard M6 hex screws with cap heads and tighten them down with a hex wrench. And then the second issue is on the copy of the telescope that I received, one of the 4 quick attachment bases is actually loose, and I don't see any way to fix that. So this makes me think that this new quick release system is maybe a little bit over-engineered, or I don't know if it's really necessary, but that was a little concerning. Now, since there are 4 attachment points, and I only really needed 2, you know, one for the bottom, the dovetail, and one for the top handle, and I wasn't using the other 2 attachment points, it wasn't really a big deal that one was loose, because I could just move around the stuff that was attached and just not use the loose one. But I just wanted to mention it because if you were attached to a loose base and then this whole thing was wobbling around, as the telescope moves and tracks the night sky, you could get movement in your subs, and it would be cause problems. Okay, the telescope ends with a 48mm thread adapter that can come off to insert a filter inside, a 2-inch filter, and there is also a secondary manual rotator back here with degree markings. This is in addition to the whole scope being able to rotate in its tube ring. So there's now 2 places you can rotate, which is cool. From the back 48mm threads, Askar says you can be between 50 and 60 millimeters back from there to reach focus, but they recommend the standard 55 millimeters, and that is what I used in my testing. Okay, so it seems this scope would be a very good match for beginners using the GTi based on weight, focal length, all seems just right, but is it a good match in practice? I'd say not exactly. It will become clearer once we get to the optical tests, but basically this scope is so sharp, the sharpest scope out of the 9, and perfect optically, that any little movement from a wind gust or a tracking error at all that would cause a guide spike over, let's say, 2 or 3 arc seconds, can cause elongation of the stars that show up in your data. And the reason for that is because the stars are so well controlled that there's very little tolerance for error. We're talking the smallest stars in focus on this are like just 1 pixel across. So if there's any little movement, you get, you know, an egg-shaped star because they're so small and well controlled. So for that reason, I don't think this is a good combination, at least for a beginner. You could change the mount to like a harmonic mount, and that would probably fix it. You could change the tripod to a much heavier tripod. Maybe that would fix it. You could change the camera to one with bigger pixels that are more forgiving, like the Canon RA has 6 micron pixels. Well, this has 3.7. That would probably also, it wouldn't show up then. But the point is, if you want to use this telescope on the GTi with a modern small pixel camera, I think you're going to have to think through some of this because what I found was I could produce good data with this combination, but not reliably, not as consistently as I'd like. This is another Askar telescope. This is their 71F. The cost of this one is $599, and then the reducer, which I used, is $189. So the total cost here was $788 if you do get both. I previously reviewed this telescope on the AM3 mount without the reducer, and I thought it did great in that context. This time I added the reducer, which brings it down from the native 490 millimeter focal length at f6.9 to 368 millimeter at f5.2. The weight with reducer without caps is 3.2 kilograms or 7 pounds 2 ounces, which is the heaviest scope I tried. And it's also significantly longer than any of the other scopes, which gives it what's called a longer moment arm, putting more force on the motors of the GTi. It is a quadruplet telescope with one ED element plus I also added the 2-element reducer, so there's 6 glass elements here, and it has a retractable dew shield with a locking knob. And both the focuser draw tube and the manual rotator have markings, and there's a spot for a 2-inch filter. It ends in 48 millimeter threads, but you can configure it to have 54 millimeter threads. Basically all the standard Askar stuff, but what's remarkable about it is it's cheap for a quad at $599. So I'll cut to the chase with this one. I've used this telescope plus the 2600 Air extensively. As I said on the ZW AM3, there was the review, but then since then I did a workshop and we all used that combination a lot. And then I've also now used it a lot on the GTi mount. And I can definitely recommend this telescope on the AM3. So I was hopeful that it would work here, but I do not recommend it on the GTi. I think the combination of how heavy it is with how long it is, it's just not a good combo. Now I know there are probably people right now thinking, well, I've already have all of this and I've made it work. And I'm sure that's true, that if you have the right personality for this, you could probably make this combination of gear work. But this channel is just general advice and advice for beginners. So if you're a beginner, I think you're going to be fighting it to get consistently round stars, especially if there's any wind and you're using the tripod that came with the GTi in the bundle, which is, I think, a lot of people who would be using the GTi. Yes, if you use a very heavy tripod, a lot of weight, you have a wind block, you do all these things, I'm sure this could work well. But as configured, I think not so much. The Svbony SV555 is, I believe, Svbony's first venture into an astro lens style telescope. And there are a few growing pains as they figure that out. The first copy they sent to me wouldn't come to focus at the standard 55 millimeter backspacing, like what would come with a ZWO camera. It needed actually 54 millimeter space to come to focus. I have all of those spacers and adapters, so I could actually get my first copy to work, but that's not ideal. And they've since fixed that, and they actually sent me a second copy, so I can confirm that the new improved version doesn't have that issue. And anyone who had one in the first batch that had that issue, you can reach out to Svbony and they'll fix it for you. Anyways, Svbony is selling this for $599 in the US. This telescope is a quad with one ED glass element, unspecified, and it's 243 millimeter focal length at f4.5. So just a little wider and faster than the Redcat 51. It is surprisingly pretty heavy considering its short stature. And I think the reason is it's like an all metal construction. It sort of reminds me of Askar's ACL 200, if you remember that one. It comes in at 2.5 kilograms or 5.5 pounds. And so you're using up exactly half of the GTi's payload limit with this telescope. The dew shield is removable, but it's a screw-on type. So it's not like super easy to remove. You have to rotate it a whole bunch. It does have front filter threads, which are the pretty standard 72 millimeters. So if you're a daytime photographer, you might have filters that work for that. On the barrel, we have a ring for aperture. It does have an internal iris. It goes from f4.5 to f22, stopped all the way down. I only used it wide open at f4.5. And there is also a focusing ring, of course. Both rings have locking knobs, both the aperture and the focus ring, which is nice. In terms of other hardware, it comes with this tube ring, and a top handle, a Vixen dovetail. Of course, the Vixen dovetail can also be reversed if you want to use this with an Arca Swiss clamp. And it also comes with this optional riser here and a belt and a bracket and screws for installing an electronic focuser, which is a nice touch that it comes with all of that stuff. On the back, we have a manual rotator with degree markings and a place to put a 2-inch filter, and it ends with the standard 48mm threads. After I got the improved second copy, I didn't run into any problems with this telescope or on the GTi. I think it's similar to the Redcat 51 in that it will just work well on the GTi. And I did use it with this riser, but actually, if you are not using an electronic focuser, it'd be better to not use the riser because then it lowers the center of gravity a little bit. Okay, and next we have the Apertura 60 EDR. You can buy this telescope in a pretty stripped down version for $399 US, or as a bundle with the field flattener and a guide scope for $549. In either case, you do need to buy the Vixen Dovetail separately, which will cost about $30 to $40. In my case, instead of the 1X flattener, I'm using a 0.8X reducer flattener from Astrotech that is compatible fully with this telescope, and it brings it down from 360mm focal length at f6 down to 288 at f4.8, which is a better match specs-wise for the GTi when using at least a small pixel camera. With a large pixel camera like the Canon RA, or many other DSLRs, I have used the Apertura 60 EDR with the flattener with the GTi and other similar mounts. So it really depends on how small your pixels are, whether I'd recommend using it at the full 360mm focal length, but probably doable. So the reducer is $140, so the total package price here with this scope as configured is $580 US, so not too bad. The weight as configured is just under 2 kilograms or 4 pounds, and it's also not very long. So all of these are good things when it comes to optimizing for the GTi. This telescope has a retractable but not locking dew shield. I did try it with my flat panel and it didn't collapse yet. It has a 2-speed rack and pinion focuser with distance markings on the draw tube. It does have a manual rotator, but no angle degree markings. I had no issue when using this telescope in combination with the GTi. I think it's light and short enough that everyone will find it just works as expected. So definitely a recommendation in terms of a telescope light enough to work well on the GTi. And finally, we have what I believe is the cheapest and smallest premium refractor on the market. This is the Askar FMA180 Pro. I like this telescope so much that I personally have 2 of them. And I previously showcased this telescope actually with the GTi in my video comparing an astronomy camera to a modified DSLR. And since then, I've continued using the Askar FMA180 as my favorite option personally on the GTi. And so I do have a lot of experience with it. The FMA180 Pro goes for $399 in the US, and it weighs just 792 grams, or 1 pound, 12 ounces. It is a sextuplet design, meaning 6 glass elements with 180mm focal length at f4.5. It has a fixed dew shield with 56mm threads on the front. It has a focus ring with a locking knob, a Cinta-style shoe for a mini guide scope, and in the back we have a manual rotator with degree markings, a filter holder, and all of this ends in a standard 48mm male thread. Underneath the telescope tube you get this little base, and that base is actually compatible with Cinta-style finder shoes. So if you want to use this as a guide scope, you could just remove this dovetail. But if you want to use this as your main scope, as I am here, it does come with this Vixen style dovetail. I think people might be sleeping on this scope because, you know, because of how it looks. It's so small. It looks like a guide scope. It only has 40mm of aperture. But I think it's actually quite good for photography. I think it's one of the best values out there at $400, better than most telephoto lenses you can get in terms of correction and sharpness. So it gets my highest recommendation for compatibility with the Star Adventurer GTi. And if you're a beginner watching this video, I really recommend this one. This is the scope to get with your GTi. You can use it with auto guiding. It has all of that capability right out of the box. But if you want to start using this telescope with a GTi without auto guiding, that's also very possible at this focal length. You know, how long your subs can be without guiding will depend on how good your polar alignment is. But I can tell you with good polar alignment, like using the ASI Air, the GTi can do 3-minute subs with this scope, no auto guiding, and get round stars pretty consistently. And I've tried that on both copies. This scope is also actually my recommendation if you want to get into mono imaging with the GTi, because then you're talking about the added weight of a filter wheel. So either something like this or a Rokinon 135, which I showed in my first review of the GTi. But either way, there are some really cool new options now for lightweight mono. I've only just started testing this, but this is the QHY Minicam 8. This is the whole camera and filter wheel right here on the back of the Askar FMA180. And I think this is just a perfect setup with everything being mini. You got the mini guide scope, the mini mono camera and filter wheel, and the mini main scope on the miniest go-to mount. And so I'll probably do a whole other video about this kind of setup, but I just wanted to sort of give you a little preview of, if you want to get into mono, I think this is a really cool combination. Okay, I think this is a good time to transition into a few additional thoughts on the Sky-watcher Star Adventurer GTi. The first thing that I'll mention here, I might have covered in a previous review, I can't remember, so sorry if I'm repeating myself, but it's about the deck axis. This is the deck axis here that I'm rotating. This is the RA axis. This is the clutch for the deck axis. And both can be a little bit sticky and hard to balance, but I found that, you know, with the counterweights and everything, it's usually a little bit easier to balance the RA axis, while the deck axis is still pretty difficult, even with this copy, which I've had for 3 years, to balance the traditional way of just letting your scope sort of fall and pushing it up and down in the saddle until it's balanced. So I have an alternate way to suggest to balance in deck, which is to just find the fulcrum. So find a smooth bore pencil or pen and put it underneath the telescope, and then just find the point where the weight imbalance moves from being front heavy to back heavy, or the other way around. And when you find that point, just put a little piece of painter's tape and an X there, and that is the fulcrum. That's the point at which the deck axis balances around, and then you just basically center that in your saddle, and you'll have good deck balance, which is an important thing to do. Speaking of the saddle, a lot of people have mentioned to me that on the GTi, they don't like how it just has this one big screw for locking in the Vixen plate into the saddle. It's a little inelegant, and then also this will mark up your, and leave a little divot in your Vixen dovetail plate, which is sort of annoying. So there is an alternative third-party solution. Apertura, the house brand for High Point Scientific, has this performance saddle replacement for the GTi. I didn't use it in my actual testing for this review, just because I wanted to keep the GTi completely stock, but I have used it outside of the review, and I can say that it is easy to install, solidly built, and the big advantage of it, I don't know if it really helps with performance, but it's that it has this clamp, so it's not going to mar your dovetail. Okay, another annoyance with the GTi is this polar scope cap is always popping off when you bump it. And a few people have told me a way to fix this, which is you warm up these plastic clips with a hairdryer for about a minute each, and then you bend them out slightly. Just a little bit is enough. And then when you position the cap back in, it's going to stay put. It actually does work. So I'm pretty impressed that something that easy fixes this annoying problem. Okay, and speaking of the polar scope, for this video, I didn't use it. I did my polar alignment using the ASI Air's polar alignment routine, and I always got to under 1 arc minute of total error. And then I wanted to mention 2 small improvements that I noticed Sky-watcher made to the GTi between the first run here and the current version for sale. The first thing I noticed is there is now a grippy rubber mat here between the mount head and the bare metal of the tripod. That was already a feature in the tripod extension, but not if you went straight from mount head to tripod, so that is really nice. And the second upgrade I liked even more, as it was something I complained about in my initial review, was for very lightweight setups like with the Askar FMA180 or telephoto lens setup, the single 5-pound counterweight that came with the GTi was too heavy to balance that kind of payload properly. So you could go out and buy an alternative counterweight or maybe make your own, but now you don't have to, because with the new version, they include 2 counterweights, a 3.5 pound and a 1.5 pound. So you can use either one or both. It's the same total, but now you can split it up. So that's really appreciated. Okay, and then finally, I had one new problem with the GTi in the making of this video I've never had before, and it has to do with using it with the ASI Air and specifically guiding and the declination axis. Even though I feel that I'd put in all the same settings for guiding between the ASI Air and PhD2 on my laptop, calibration and guiding in PhD2 will work just fine. While on the ASI Air, it never finishes calibrating the deck axis, and then it tries to make corrections to get back on track, but it always gets stuck at about 25 arc minutes out, and then it won't correct any further back in than that. And so interestingly, this is the case with both copies of the GTi that I have when pairing them with the 2600 Air or 2600 Duo using ASI Air to run those. But then if I connect one of these setups, this exact same setup, to the laptop and run it with PhD2, it works just fine. So what I ended up doing, because I wanted to try testing with the ASI Air for this review, was in the ASI Air, I just switched the deck mode from auto to off, letting it calibrate in right ascension only, and then everything would work quite well. It really might just be a glitch with this particular combination of hardware, but I thought it was worth adding a little section explaining what was going on there.
Okay, now we're on to the optical performance, and I'll start by showing single 3-minute subs from each telescope, and then we'll do comparisons of crops and things like that. But this is the Takahashi FS-60CB. This is one of the better 3-minute subs that I captured in terms of sharpness. I'll make it full screen here for a second for people that like to see that. Okay, and this is 255 millimeters, which gives us a field of view of just over 5 degrees wide at a pixel scale of 3 arc seconds per pixel and a focal ratio of f4.2. Considering this is f4.2, it is very sharp. This is, again, the most expensive telescope I'm reviewing, so you could sort of expect that. But it's not free of aberrations. You can see here, even in the center, let me make this a little bit bigger. The stars have this sort of magenta red fringe around them. Now, it's very even on the stars, and so it will be pretty easy to remove with software. Something like Adobe Camera Raw's defringe tool works very well for this kind of even red fringe. But it's interesting. It reminds me actually of some Canon L lenses that I've used that I think also use fluorite. Instead of having any blue bloat, they have this red chromatic aberration on basically all the stars. And then also, like premium lenses, this corner performance is similar to me in that the stars are very sharp, but if you look closely at the bright stars, they have quite a bit of distortion that basically makes them into triangles, sort of wonky triangles, a little bird-like, but that's a combination, I guess, of a couple different kinds of distortion that causes that in the corners. Now, this is really blown up. This is like at like 400% view or something. So this is actually, 100. This is 100% view. So keep that in mind, that it really doesn't look too bad in terms of at 100% view, the stars look sharp in the corners. It's really, you need to really pixel peep to see that. And then in terms of vignetting, this I think tells the story too, that the corners are a little bit darker than the center, but not much vignetting on an APS-C sensor. Okay, and then this is an even faster scope. Going from f4.2 to f3.9, that sounds like it's like only a little bit faster, but it's actually significantly faster. So this scope is by far the fastest that I tried at f3.9. And so you can expect that the stars will have a little bit of a softer experience. Whenever I'm below f4 with a telescope, I find that the stars are a little bit soft. But the trade-off, of course, is that you get a better signal-to-noise ratio faster. So if you're going after very dim objects, that is nice. Not a whole lot of vignetting, but a little bit here on an APS-C size sensor. A little bit less, I'd say, than the TOC that we just looked at. And then in terms of the corner stars, yeah, there's a little bit of elongation that might be tilt. But in terms of sharpness, I'd say they're basically on par with the center. To me, it's just like the stars are just a little bit soft across the field, but in terms of corner performance, I think this is pretty good. We get a little bit of elongation, but I'm not sure if that's tilt or not. And then the field of view is very similar to what we just had with the Takahashi. It's also identical to what we would get with the Redcat. And again, this is with the reducer, which puts it at 250 millimeter focal length. Oh, and since I haven't yet, here, I'll make this full screen. This is just one 3-minute sub with the Founder Optics Draco 62. Okay, next we have the Starfield Gear60 Quad, and let's make this 3-minute sub full screen right away. So if you just saw the Founder Optics, you can now compare to the Starfield Gear60. This is 300 millimeter focal length at f5. And so at f5, the stars are just going to be sharper somewhat because it's, it's more things get more controlled at slower focal ratios. So keep that in mind. This is a little bit smaller field, 4.5 degrees across. Yeah, not much to say here. Basically, no vignetting. I know that, let me bring this bigger. I know that this side looks darker than this side, but that's, I think, just an effect of the dust. And there's like no dust on this side and some dark nebula, which makes the sky slightly brighter actually on this side. So I would say that this basically has no vignetting at APS-C based on, if you look at this corner versus the center, they're the same brightness level. And then here they are zoomed in. It's like no difference. Also, this is incredibly well corrected. I'm really seeing no chromatic aberration, at least yet. And the center and corner on an APS-C size sensor almost look identical in terms of sharpness. I would say the corner is just slightly softer, but no visible star-shaped distortion. They look nice and round. So that's impressive. Okay, and then we have the Askar SQA55. This is in between the first two that I showed you and the Gear 60 in terms of focal length and field of view. It's at 264 millimeter focal length at f4.8. I'll go ahead and make this single sub full frame for you to take a look. And this is the sharpest telescope that I tried. I can tell both visually, but also it was backed up by the median full width half maximum. It was the only one that hit 4.0 arc seconds. Everything else was at 4.5 or 5. So it was significantly sharper than anything else in terms of making those star sizes very small across the field. I think you can see probably from this, let me make this bigger, that it really just is sharp from corner to corner. I don't think there's much vignetting. It looks a little bit darker for some reason than the Gear 60, but that just might be conditions and where I shot it in the sky. Maybe there's just a little bit of vignetting because the center does look quite a bit brighter than this corner on this one. So I don't know, maybe there's a little bit of vignetting. If we blow up that corner, that looks pretty darn good. I mean, maybe just a tiny bit of elongation, but that actually might be a tracking or guiding error because, as I said, I found it very challenging to find subs that didn't have some elongation with this because these stars are just so sharp that I think it's not a perfect match with the GTi. Very little, if any, chromatic aberration. Very well corrected in terms of star shape and sharpness. Okay, then we have the William Optics Redcat 51. Again, very similar specs to what we've been seeing. Basically, the same focal length as the reduced Founder Optics, but quite a bit slower at f4.9, but similar to the SQA55 that we just saw. But you can see the median full width half maximum of a good sub with the Redcat is 5.6 arc seconds, and a good sub with the SQA55 was 4 arc seconds. So a big difference in sort of star size there. And I think that bears out when we look at these samples. First, I'll make the sub full in your screen. Okay, and then here is the aberration inspector. You can see not much vignetting to speak of. I don't really see any. Here is the center blown up to 400%, and I can make it even bigger. They're a little bit softer than the SQA55 and the Gear60, I'd say, but still perfectly presentable in terms of a wide field optic like this. And then in the corner, you can see we're just getting a little bit of distortion, but really not too much, just a little bit. And the stars are almost as sharp in the corner as they are in the center. They're just a little bit maybe more distorted in the corner. Okay, this is interesting to me. This is the Askar 71F with the reducer to bring it down to f5.2. And I'm not sure about this reducer because the Askar 71F without reducer I thought was a pretty sharp telescope. But with the reducer, even though this is the slowest telescope that I'm trying, even with the reducer at f5.2, the stars look pretty soft, more like what I'd expect with a very fast scope like the Founder Optics at f3.9. But this is the slowest scope. So I'm not sure if maybe I just got a bad reducer or if it's just the fact that because I don't think the 71F is well matched with the GTi, it's making the stars soft just through, I don't know, tracking guiding error. The median full width half maximum is pretty good. Keep in mind that's because there's all these small stars that it's picking up because it's also the longest focal length, biggest aperture that I'm testing. So that's why sometimes I don't include this median full width half maximum, especially when I'm testing scopes of different apertures, because it can be a little bit misleading. You really have to look at visually what the scope is producing to know the kind of performance we'd get for photography. So there's the aberration inspector. I'll go ahead and make this single 3-minute sub full screen. And you can definitely see there is some vignetting on this scope, but not terrible, just a little bit. And in terms of center to corner performance, I would say the corners have a bit more distortion, but all the bright stars have some kind of distortion here, sort of like I don't know, like a cross-like shape, an iron cross kind of distortion. Sometimes you think that just comes from pinched optics, so maybe it's that, but I can't be sure. Okay, here we have the Svbony SV555. I'll go ahead and make this single 3-minute sub full screen. Okay, and this is at 243 millimeter focal length, so one of the widest that I tested. The field of view becomes 5.5 degrees. It's at f4.5, and What I thought was interesting about this scope is, according to the median full width half maximum, it's a fairly not sharp telescope. But in terms of visual impact, I actually think it looks quite good. So it goes to show you the numbers and what we think visually don't always match up. Here's the aberration inspector. I think it's sort of like what people often say about the Askar telescopes is that they're not the sharpest, but they're well corrected, and that's what I would say about the Svbony here. Is that the stars are a little bit bigger across the field, but in terms of center to corner, they look pretty similar. Let's look at a bright star here. So in this view, I don't see any real distortion on the bright stars. I think that's going to change when we look at the stacked picture, which is interesting. And then in terms of corner performance, again, this looks pretty good. Not much distortion on the corner stars. Okay, next up we have the Apertura 60 EDR. This is reduced from 360, and I'm using a Astrotech 0.8x reducer to get there. The focal ratio with the reducer is f4.8. Let's look at the single 3-minute sub full screen. And you might have been able to see in that full screen display that I did have some tilt issue where the left side, and I'll make this bigger, is clearly showing some tilt while the right side looks basically perfect. So I didn't chase down that tilt issue, use a tilt adjuster. I don't have time to do that in these tests, but you can basically just disregard this left side because it could be corrected with a tilt adjuster. I'd say the middle and this right column are more reflective of the actual optical performance of this telescope with reducer, which, considering the price with both, is like under $600, I think is quite impressive. There's the center, there's the corner, and yes, there is a little bit of split chromatic aberration, there's a little bit of distortion, but overall, I think it looks pretty decent. Not a huge difference in the star quality from center to corner. Okay, so if you remember with the Svbony, I said that was one of the widest I tested. Now this one, Askar FMA180, is significantly wider. This is 180 millimeter focal length, so that puts the field of view at about 7.5 degrees across. So significantly wider than anything else I tested, but I think it stacks up pretty well against the bigger telescopes. With just 40 millimeters of aperture, I was still getting a median full width half maximum at 5.2 arc seconds. And you can sort of see that here in the results. I'll make this full single 3-minute sub full screen here for you. I think, this looks really pretty sharp across the whole field. If you look closely, let's look in the center here. Not a little bit of chromatic aberration if you really sort of squint at some of the stars, but not too bad. And then if we look at the corner, there's definitely a little bit of elongation, a little bit of distortion here visible, but still pretty sharp. It sort of actually reminds me of the Takahashi in that respect, and that it's sharp, but a little bit distorted in the corner. Okay, so that is the Askar FMA180 Pro. Now we're going to move on to comparisons. Okay, and the way that I'm going to do these comparisons is I have 9 telescopes, so I'm breaking them into groups of 3 based on price. So these are the 3 most expensive telescopes, the Takahashi, the Founder Optics, and the Starfield Gear60. So we'll start with these 3, looking at first here corner performance. So these are 400 pixel crops. So what I mean by that is a square 400 by 400 pixel crop of the corner. We're now looking at stacks of 14 3-minute subs for a total of 42-minute integration. And these all look pretty good at just 100% view here. Obviously, the Founder Optics looks a little bit softer than the other two, but the Takahashi is double the price and the Gear 60 is at f5. Well, the Founder Optics is at f3.9. So I always remind people of that. You have to keep that in mind, that there's always trade-offs with a faster scope. But let's zoom in a little bit and just take a look. Okay, so the Takahashi clearly has a fair amount of chromatic aberration. The Founder Optics, I'm not seeing a lot of chromatic aberration, but it has this sort of like soft halo off to one side on the bright stars. And then and it really seems to be mostly affecting the bright stars on the Founder Optics. The small stars look pretty good. The Gear 60 is the best corrected, just a little bit of chromatic aberration, but pretty round for that being the extreme corner. Okay, and then here we have the middle three in terms of price. This is the Askar SQA55 on the left, the Redcat 51 in the middle, and the Askar 71F on the right. And this is sort of an extreme lineup. I found it interesting just because the Askar looks so perfect. The Redcat looks basically well corrected, but a little bit softer, and then the Askar 71F is quite different. But a lot of that comes down to focal length. You know, this one is 368 millimeter focal length, so you're a lot more zoomed in than these two, which are much more similar. So keep that in mind. But let's zoom in and take a look at these corner crops. Okay, the Askar, now that I'm looking at the this registered one with 14 subs, I'm not seeing any of that elongation that I saw in the single sub. These look like nice round stars in the corner. The Redcat, we are still seeing a little bit of distortion on these stars, and they're pretty soft. The Askar 71F, they're soft, and we're seeing some of that same kind of thing that we saw on the Founder Optics with like a sort of soft halo off to one side on the bright stars. Okay, then the last three, we have the Apertura 60 on the left, the Svbony SV555 on the middle, and the Askar 180 on the right. And just from first appearance, you can definitely see the Svbony and the Askar look pretty sharp. The Apertura looks more bloated. That's typical with a doublet. Sort of what you'd expect, that the stars are a bit bigger. The Svbony looks really nice, I gotta say. I'm not really seeing any problems with the Svbony. The Askar 180 does have distortion, which is even more noticeable when you stack. It's like it almost looks like a back focus issue, but I don't think it is. I think it's just that it's such a wide field at 180 millimeter focal length that you're going to get some corner distortion no matter what. And so given the extreme field of view, I don't think that looks too bad. And then the Apertura 60, like I said, looks pretty well corrected. The star size is going to be bigger with a doublet like that. The next test I like to do is I take a center crop and I really, really saturate it, applying the same amount of saturation to each one, but more saturation than you normally would, just to show any issues or how sort of well corrected a particular scope is. And the main news here that I want to point out, let's zoom way in here, is the Takahashi. It was clear in the single subs, but it's even clearer when you do a stack like this, has that sort of red chromatic aberration all around each star that I've seen mostly with Canon L lenses that I've used. And it is something you can remove somewhat in post-processing, but it's better, if it doesn't have that to begin with. You can really see it, like, for instance, look at these two stars here. They're really actually best, I think, in color in the founder optics. We're seeing a little bit of that red chromatic aberration in the Gear 60, but then it's very clear in the Tak FS-60. And then another place I think it's noticeable is here on this star. This is like a yellowish star. It shouldn't have that red fringe on it, and it doesn't really in the Founder Optics or the Gear 60. But these two bright stars here are also an interesting test case in that on the Tak FS-60, look at how it handles that blue star. That's basically like a perfect profile. So blue stars, the Tak FS-60 is probably going to be the best of the whole batch with that fluorite lens. Now with the Gear 60 over here on the right, the actual bright part of the star here is smaller than the Tak FS-60, which you'd expect because this one's f5 and this one's f4.2. But then if you look at the halo, it does have some of this, some of these spikes coming out of it, while this one is just like a perfectly soft profile. And then the Founder Optics has these 4 visible little triangles coming in on all these bright stars. This sort of, I think they often call this the iron cross effect on telescopes. Now, this is, of course, pixel peeping. When you zoom back out like this, it's harder to see. All you can really see when you zoom back out is that the stars look smallest on the Gear 60, second smallest on the Tak, and biggest on the Founder Optics, which just follows focal ratio. But, like I said, I don't know if you can see this. I can clearly see this on my monitor. Sometimes this doesn't come across in YouTube videos, unfortunately, because of video compression, but there is way more noise in the Gear 60 than there is in the Tak FS-60, and then the Tak FS-60 has more noise than the Founder Optics, and this all comes down to focal ratio again. So when you're going after dim objects, that's the trade-off. Bigger stars, but you'll get better signal to noise. Okay, next up we have the center crops for the Askar SQA55 on the left, Redcat 51 in the middle, and Askar 71F on the right. And let's go ahead and zoom in and take a look. Okay, so let's start over here on the right. The Askar 71F has that same iron cross effect on the bright stars that the Founder Optics did. The Redcat 51 and Askar SQA55 look pretty similar, except you can see, like, for instance, if you look at right here, see these two little stars right there that are appearing? They're completely lost in the Redcat 51, and that's because this is a sharper telescope. There's other little stars popping up here that are just 1 pixel across, probably, but they're almost visible. Here's another split right here. You can see right there. There's a little split, and here they're not split. It almost becomes a line. So you can see the SQA55 is clearly sharper than the Redcat 51, and the Redcat 51 has more chromatic aberration. Like if you look at, let's see here, this star right here, see this little blue hat on this star? Not on the SQA55. This is perfect in color, this star right here. It should be this nice yellow star, and it is. Same thing with this star right here. There's like a little blue hat on it. On this one, it looks a lot better. Okay, and then we have the Apertura 60 EDR on the left, the Svbony SV555 in the middle, and the Askar FMA180 Pro on the right. And at just first glance at 100%, I would say these three actually look pretty similar. Like, I don't know if I could pick them apart in a lineup and tell you, like, this is this scope, this is this scope. They just look very similar to my eye. These are the 3 cheapest scopes I tested. Okay, let's take a look zoomed in though. Okay. Again, they look pretty similar zoomed in. The major thing that stands out is the Svbony does have this weird little bite out of the bright stars. And I think Trevor from Astro Backyard mentioned this in his review too. I did look at data stacked from both the first copy they sent me and the second copy they sent me, and both had this little artifact once I stacked the data. But what was interesting is I couldn't really see it in the single subs. It only like appeared once I stacked. I'd also say that the Svbony looks a little bit softer at this zoom level than the other two, just a little bit. And actually the Askar FMA180 with the smallest aperture of these three, I think maybe looks the sharpest, but that might also be, I'm seeing noise. I don't know, because this is also the noisiest with the smallest aperture. So, anyways, you can make up your own mind about this comparison. I think that in terms of chromatic aberration, sharpness, they look pretty similar. Really just the difference is that little weird aberration on the Svbony, just on bright stars. But it's not really visible at 100% view, only when you pixel peep by really zooming in. Okay, and then the last set of comparisons I wanted to make was trying my best, and I'm not like perfect at this, to follow the exact same processing routine for each stacked image, and doing it sort of what I would do if I was processing these photos. Now, keep in mind, these are only 40-minute stacks, so I'm not going to be able to bring out as much as I'd like. So these are all fairly conservative in terms of how much of the nebula I'm bringing out. But I wanted to just show this because I think in this comparison, it'll give you a sense of the field of view. Again, I wasn't perfect about rotation, so you can see it's slightly different, but hopefully it'll still give you sort of a flavor of what these will look like once processed. And I'll zoom in a little bit just to show you. Oh, another reason I think this is really interesting to show is if you remember when we looked at just sort of like the screen stretched comparisons, the founder optics here, the stars looked much bigger and much wonkier than these other two. But once you actually do processing with like my typical star processing and stretching the stars separately, there's hardly any difference. So it's something to really keep in mind, that when I'm showing these comparisons, I'm really trying to show the optical performance of the telescope. But once it comes to processing, you can get really good results out of many different telescopes, and it can be a completely different story. Okay, but let's really zoom in here on these stars and take a look. And I mean, if you really look closely, you can probably still see that the stars are slightly tighter on the Gear 60 over here, but not as noticeable as before. The other thing to pay attention to is if you look at, this dark area over here, because the founder optics is at f3.9, you're seeing a lot more detail in this dark area. You're seeing a little bit less, but still some in the Takahashi up here, and then quite a bit less in the Gear 60 because it's at f5. So you're trading sharper stars for slower optics. F5 is still not considered slow by any means. It's just not as fast as these other two. But then actually here, what's interesting is that was the dark area, right? You're seeing the most here, second most here, least here. But then look at the bright area here in the center. I'm actually seeing more, a little bit more detail in the bright area in the Gear 60. And I think that might just come down to some of these details are actually pretty small, and it's picking up a little bit more of them right here around the main star. So definitely some trade-offs to consider, but I'd say any of these three can make a really pleasing image, of course. So That's the comparison of the three most expensive. Let's go into the middle three. Okay, here's the middle three. Sorry that the rotations are slightly different, but the VDB31 is centered in each, so I felt that was what was important. Okay, let's go ahead and zoom in. The Askar SQA55 is here on top. Askar 71F is down here on the left, and then Redcat 51 is down on the right. It's an interesting comparison. It almost feels like I put too much noise reduction on the 71F, but I don't remember doing anything differently. But anyways, it looks sort of like weirdly like too smooth, like I put more noise reduction on it, but I don't remember doing that. So I don't know why that one looks different, but let's compare the, because this one I don't really think is that suitable for the GTi anyways. I'm going to go ahead and just like take it out of our comparison here for a second. Okay, so now I'm just comparing the Askar SQA55 on the left and the Redcat 51 on the right. Excuse the slight differences in noise levels. I'm not sure why the Askar SQA55 looks noisier. I think it actually just might come down to it's capturing more detail, but it also might be like conditions related. But something I just wanted to point out is if you like look at sort of the amount of detail captured here in the dust, it's bringing out a lot more definition than here. Like there's like more like micro contrasts. And then also I'm seeing more small stars. Okay, last three to compare processed. Here's the Apertura 60 on the top, the Svbony 555 on the lower left, and then the Askar 180 processed on the lower right. And personally, I just love wide field. So the Svbony and the Askar being the two widest telescopes I tested, they're sort of my favorites for this scene because especially this Askar FMA180, because you're getting these little fingers of dust down here that weren't captured in any of the other scopes. But the Svbony has a nice field of view as well. Let me actually just make the Askar full screen here for a second to show you a couple things. So yeah, I like how it has these two Vandenberg reflection nebulae both visible. You get some other interesting dust over here, but then I love this corner with these three fingers and these three fingers of dust, and then there's this little other reflection nebula right there. That's cool. I know this is noisy when I zoom in like this, but it's really meant to be experienced more wide like this to get sort of the full picture. Okay, zooming in, not a whole lot of interest here zoomed in terms of detail compared to some of the higher end ones, but nothing bad either. I think that they all do a fairly nice job. Yeah. Oh, should I also just say about noise? I think I mentioned when we were looking at sort of the screen stretches that the Askar FMA180 had visibly more noise, being a smaller aperture scope. Now that we're looking at them processed, it's not as noticeable. I'd still say the Apertura 60, the signal to noise ratio looks a little better because it's a larger aperture. But I'm not really seeing that like the Askar 180 really stands out in terms of noise levels compared to the other two once processed. Okay, and then for anyone interested, I just took all of the data that I captured from all these 9 telescopes and stacked it all together and did a quick processing on that just to show you this object in all its glory here. I think it's a really cool object. It's this blue reflection nebula in the middle is called Vandenberg 31. And then this dark nebula that sort of makes a letter-like shape. I know that has Barnard designations, maybe like Barnard 26 through 28. I can't remember. Something like that. You can look it up. But Vandenberg 31 is the thing in the middle that I trained the ASI Air to center, and you can see it has this sort of like streak-like reflection nebula and then it extends a little bit into here. I've seen some images of this where this whole area is more blue. Probably with more data, I could do that as well. There's also a little background galaxy right above it, right up here. That's cool. And this is in on sort of the border of Auriga and Taurus, if you are interested. So it's sort of a winter nebula object, at least in the northern hemisphere.
Okay, so all of these telescopes that I've reviewed are more than capable for astrophotography, and hopefully I've given you some data to look at to start thinking about that. But if you own the Sky-watcher Star Adventurer GTi, or you're thinking of buying this mount, here's how I'd split them up. I'd say the 71F with reducer is not recommended by me on the GTi. It's just too heavy, I think, for the GTi. If your counterweights are all the way down at the bottom of the shaft, the GTi is not going to work as well. So if you want to use 70mm aperture, I'd probably look at the lightest doublet with flattener you can find, maybe like the Apertura 72. I think I looked up, and it's 2 pounds lighter than the 71F, so that might be a good choice. Okay, and then the Founder Optics Draco 62, the Starfield Gear60, and the Askar SQA55 are all very nice premium scopes. I think they're great. They all have different strengths, but for various reasons, I didn't get the high level of consistency in results on the GTi that I'd like with those ones. You know, if I'm throwing out 30% or more of my subs due to star elongation, it's just a bit high for me. Maybe you'd rather, get that premium performance and throw out 30 or 40% of your subs if you see any elongation. But all of those scopes, including the 71F, would I think work a lot better on the GTi with a beefier tripod. I think because if it was a nice heavy tripod, you were really weighing it down, then the payload wouldn't be so heavy compared to the mount and tripod. And then it wouldn't, blow around in the wind quite as much and just have all these problems. So I think that, there's ways around it, but with the default tripod that comes in the package, which is I'm guessing how most beginners would use this mount, that's where I don't recommend these heavier scopes. And then the Apertura 60 EDR with reducer, the Takahashi FS-60CB with reducer, the Svbony SV555, and the Redcat 51 all worked well on the GTi, so they're recommended as a combo even for beginners. To get the most out of them, you'd probably want to get guiding eventually, but you could start with any of those, I think, with no guiding, as long as you do a good polar alignment, and then just limit to shorter exposures. Like I'd start around 45 seconds, maybe then go up to 60, 75, 90, just sort of find a sweet spot where you're not throwing away too much data, because in most your subs that you get round stars. And then my highest recommendation is this one right here, the Askar FMA180 Pro. For $400, this telescope punches way above its weight in terms of sharpness and performance. And on the GTi, it just makes a lot of sense to have a very lightweight telescope or lens, as a beginner especially, because you'll find that it just works much easier. You won't be having to fight it as you would with a heavier setup. I found with good polar alignment using this setup right here, the FMA180 Pro and the ASI 2600, I could do 3-minute subs unguided, which is what the same length I was using with guiding. So that's pretty impressive. I also personally really like the more wide field of view I got by pairing the FMA 180 with an APS-C sized sensor. Because I really like those wide vistas of space where you get all the dust and it looks really cool. But if you wanted a more traditional sort of cropped in field of view, you could pair this with the Sony IMX585 sensor that's getting popular in lots of astro cameras, and that would work really well on the GTi. And it would also save you some money over something like the ASI 2600 if you're looking at astro cameras. As my previous video showed, this also pairs well with modified DSLR or mirrorless. So the least expensive option is my highest recommendation for the GTi. But if you're on a different mount, maybe a different scope might make more sense for you. And hopefully this test revealed some of the strengths and weaknesses of each of these small telescopes it was a lot of work, but a lot of fun to put this together. And if you're looking for even more help, like personal help based on your particular needs and situation and budget, I offer that service through direct messaging on my Patreon, which is my paid membership community. And you're now seeing the names of all of the folks who have already become members of the Nebula Photos Patreon community. And I want to thank everyone on this list here so much for the support, because it's how I'm able to do this job full time and spend so much time, so many hours making a video like this one. And it's a lot of fun. And while I do spend a lot of time on making these videos, which I release for free on YouTube, I do pride myself on making my Patreon offering worth it, because you are paying something for it. It starts at just $1 per month, and at that tier you get that direct messaging support with me, but also access to my Patreon only channels on Discord, so you can get help from other people in the community. A lot of them know a ton of stuff and different stuff than me, you know, like solar imaging I know nothing about, but I'm sure you can find someone out there in my community who does. And then it also includes monthly challenges, which are a lot of fun. And then there are additional higher tiers if you're interested in other kinds of perks. Like at $7 a month, I release all my YouTube videos ad-free on Patreon. And at $25 a month, I'll send you a signed print of my work. And so if you like what I'm doing here on YouTube, I think you might also like joining my Patreon. Again, it starts at just $1 a month, and it's patreon.com/nebulaphotos to sign up. Well, till next time, this has been Nico Carver wishing everyone clear skies.